Hey everyone, so this week in math we have been going over our math book, pages 9 through 19, and the topics we've been talking about are place value and going over numbers up to the 100,000. So if you have your math book, you can go ahead and get that and follow along because I will do a couple of examples and I'll let you know which page numbers. So we've been going over place value and we've talked about the different periods of large numbers. So when numbers start getting very large, we separate those with a comma. After we get out of the hundreds period, we use a comma to show that now we are in the thousands period. So each period, so here we have the hundreds period, and the thousands period, each period follows the same pattern. The pattern is ones, tens, hundreds. Ones, tens, hundreds. Even though the pattern is the same, there is a big difference because of which period they're in. So 1,000 is very different from 1,000. So if we were talking money and someone said, would you want $1 or would you want $1,000? I'm pretty sure you would pick $1,000. So the period matters, but it does follow the same pattern of ones, tens, hundreds, ones, tens, hundreds. But when we get into the thousands period, we're getting into what I had called today in our lesson, the big boy numbers. So hundreds go behind the comma, and once we get into the thousands, those go in front of the comma. And soon we'll be exploring millions, and we will need another comma. But for now, just focus on the comma that separates the hundreds period from the thousands period. So in this example, I have a 6 in the 10,000s column. So 10 times 6 is 60. So we have 60,000. And then we also have 5,000. So we would say the thousands period first in the number. We would say it as 65,058. So we have a 6 in the 10,000s column. So that's 65,000. This is 60,000 plus 5,000 is 65,000. Over here, we don't have any hundreds. So we just say the hundreds period as 58. 65,058. So that's just a review of our hundreds period, our thousands period, and why the comma is important. So there's 3 ways to write numbers. I did show you the first way right here, which is standard form, how you normally see a number written out. Another way is word form. So you've had this template on one of your assignments this week, just for reference in case you needed to know how to spell any of the numbers. It goes up to 20, and then we go by tens. So all of the numbers 1 through 20 are spelled out for you. So that way you get the 1 through 10, you get 11, 12, and all the teen numbers. And then you get to 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. Because if you have, let's say 43, you just look at 40. And then you come over here and you find 3 and you combine those together and you can make 43. Right here you have 100, so this is showing 100, but if you want to spell 500, you obviously don't need to say 5,100. You would just say 5, take out that 1, and then say 100. Here's 1,000. That's also an important one for what we're learning now, because we're learning up to the 100,000s place value. We went over the 3 different ways of writing numbers. So the standard form in example A is how you're used to seeing a number. Then the word form is spelling it out like the table we were just looking at right here. So 92,000, because that's in the thousands period. 92,000, see how it's in front of that comma. Then I'm going to say my hundreds period. 92,000, comma, 170. So here's my thousands period. Here's my hundreds period. Here's standard form, word form. Then expanded form. So expanded form is where we break down every single place value. So we have the ones, the tens, the hundreds, the thousands, and the 10,000s. So we break down each of those place values and then we add them together. So the 9 is in the 10,000s place. 9 times 10 is 90. So this is 90,000. The 2 is in the thousands place. So this is 2,000. 90,000 plus 2,000. The 1 is in the hundreds place. That was the missing number that we needed to fill in, so plus 100. And the 7 is in the tens place. Not the 10,000s, just the tens, because this is in the hundreds period. So 7 tens is equal to 70. Since we have 0 ones, we don't need to put plus 0. That is unnecessary. So these are just examples of the 3 ways of writing a number: standard form, word form, and expanded form. So that was page 9 if you weren't able to follow along with us in class. Okay, today we're going to be exploring rounding. So now that we have a better idea of place value, we want to use that knowledge to be able to estimate. So when you estimate, it's telling you about how much or how many. So estimating is not an exact number. Estimating is just like about how much. So it's a very reasonable, very close guess to the exact amount. And to get an estimate, we can round. So we're going to round. And I like that it says round because you can kind of visualize something being round like a circle. And the number that looks like a circle is 0. So when we round, we like to round to a specific place value, and then everything behind it is going to be a 0. So we are actually on page 17 if you would like to follow along. Page 17 if you have your math book. This word problem tells us during May 2008, the Mount Rushmore National Monument in South Dakota welcomed 138,202 visitors. A website reported that about 100,000 people visited the park during that month. Was the estimate reasonable? So we're going to round our number to the nearest 100,000. So our exact number is 138,202 people. So I want to go to my place value chart and I want to plot that number. So I want to get out of present mode so that I can do this. So I'm going to go back to my place value chart, and this is going to help me organize my big giant number. So I'm going to clear this from the number that I was working with before, so that way I can put my new number. And this is going to help my numbers be nice and organized, and it's going to help me read this number in a friendly way. Okay, my number was 138,202. So 100,000, 30,000, 8,000, 200s, 0 tens, and 2 ones. So I have my ones place, tens place, hundreds place. That's my hundreds period. Then my comma. And now I'm looking at my thousands period. So in my hundreds thousand, I have 1. In my 10,000s, I have 3. So 3 times 10 is 30. So this represents 30,000 right here. And in my thousands column, I have 8. 138,202. So I like putting my number in that place value chart so it's nice and organized. So I have a better idea of where everything is. I can go back to my problem. If I'm rounding to the nearest 100,000, my options are going to be 100,000 or 200,000. So the nearest 100,000. So is it going to be the place value that I'm already in? Or am I going to move up to 200,000? Which one's closer? Is my number closer to 1 or to 2? So if we look at this on a number line, if I have 100,000 right here, my next 100,000 has to be 200,000. Oh, that's a lot of zeros. I don't know if I'm going to make it. Oh, I went off the page. I need another 0. Okay, let's erase that and try it again. Maybe I can make these zeros smaller. See, these numbers are so big, the zeros. There's so many zeros. Okay, here we go. Now they're tiny because I'm trying to fit them on the page. Okay, so that fits on the page. But for your 100,000s, our number 138,202, we're trying to round that to the nearest 100,000. So is it going to stay where it is? Or is it going to go to the next 100,000, which would be 200,000? So there's a way of figuring that out. If we go back over here. So whatever place value you're looking at, and in this case, the place value that we're looking at is the hundred thousands. When you're rounding, you always look at the neighbor. You look at the one before it. So in the 10,000s place, the value of this number matters a lot. So the number to the right. So if your neighbor is 5 or more, so in this case, it's the 10,000s, but this rule is true for any time you're rounding. If your neighbor is 5 or more, then you raise the score. You go to the next, in this case, 100,000. If your neighbor is 4 or less, you let it rest. You stay where you are. So our rule for that, if your neighbor is 5 or more, then you raise the score. You go to the next biggest one. Your value is big enough to round or to estimate to that next value. If your neighbor is 4 or less, you stay with where you are. You let it rest. So 5 or more, raise the score. 4 or less, let it rest. So I will type that. So when you are rounding, look at your neighbor to the right. If your neighbor is 5 or bigger, 5 or more, raise the score. So that means it's not 100,000, it would be 200,000. So if your neighbor is a 5, 6, a 7, an 8, or a 9, you would raise the score. You would go to the next biggest value. If your neighbor is 4 or less, let it rest. So you're not going to raise the score. You're not going to go to the biggest value. You're going to keep it where it is, because right now we're in the 100,000s. Our number has 100,000, and we're wanting to know which 100,000 do we round to? Is our number of 138,202, is that closer to 100,000? Or is it closer to 200,000? So our neighbor is going to be really important. If your neighbor is 4 or less, you let it rest. So if your neighbor is 4, 3, 2, 1, or 0, you're not going over to the next bigger number. You're staying where you are. So our number right now is 138,202. So we don't know, are we going to go to the 100,000s when we round, or are we going to go to the 200,000s, because we're rounding to the nearest 100,000. So in the 100,000, we have ones, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, 100,000. So here's our 100,000. But remember, we have to look at our neighbor. So our neighbor is the 3. Our neighbor is a 3. Look at your neighbor to the right. I did. My neighbor to the right is a 3, because I'm rounding to the nearest 100,000. So when you're looking at the place value you're rounding to, look to the right. That's your neighbor. If your neighbor is 5 or more, raise the score. Our neighbor's a 3. We can't go over here. Our neighbor is a 3. We're not raising the score. We're not going over to 200,000. If your neighbor is 4 or less, yes, our neighbor is 3. So our neighbor's 4 or less, we need to let it rest. We need to keep the 100,000 that we already have. So that 100,000 right here, 100,000. When we round, we're not going to raise the score. We're rounding to the nearest 100,000. Our neighbor is too small to bump us over here to 200,000. So we had to look at the 10,000s place. But that number is not big enough to raise the score to go to the 200,000. So we have to rest. So our number of 138,202 rounded to the nearest 100,000 is 100,000. So when we come back to our problem and we want to know if the estimate of 100,000 was reasonable, we are going to say that 138,202 is closer to 100,000 than it is to 200,000. Our neighbor was just too small. That 138,202, the 3 in that 10,000s place, that was 4 or less. So we had to rest. We had to stay with the 100,000, that we already had. We did not have enough to go over to the 200,000.